So continuing on from where we left off the last day, we talked about evolution, the theory of evolution, and of course the important mind that was behind that, namely Charles Darwin, and his theory that as life progresses it changes, okay? And a very simple rule is at play which we call natural selection. And natural selection basically means that those good traits, okay, those good characteristics that animals and plants have that help them to survive for longer and therefore reach reproduction age and be able to reproduce new generations, they are traits that we want to pass on to the next generations. So over time, remember what I told you? The good is kept and that which isn't so good is kind of wiped out. Okay, so therefore there's a refining going on. Species are being refined down through time in order to make sure that the good characteristics remain and stay with the animal. And what I mean by good characteristics are those characteristics that allow them to survive longer and to get to the age of reproduction and reproduce new generations. So just to finish this off, we're not going to have a long class today because we don't have very much left to do on this thing. I just want to talk very quickly about natural selection and evolution, that how one leads to the other. Does the refinement of a species lead to a change in a species? And I suppose it's a self-answering question, really, okay? Because if you're changing or refining a species to highlight the good and play down the negative, the bad, then obviously changes are going to take place, okay? And where do these changes take place and how do they take place? Well, over long periods of time, natural selection, remember what I told you? Natural selection, it means you enhance the good and you get rid of the bad, okay? Natural selection may cause gradual evolution or change within a given species. Now, a species is a group of animals with similar characteristics. So here's an example. If you take, for example, the raven and what it feeds on, okay? So ravens have been adapted to feed on green bugs. Simple as that, all right? So the green beetles down here are part of the staple diet for these ravens. Now, over many generations, the bugs begin to realize that they're not going to survive very long if they're green. They're going to be picked off and eaten as food for these particular birds. So over time, you notice what's beginning to happen? The number of brown beetles that begin to appear is increasing. So over time, there's a realization that green ain't so good for survival reasons and brown seems to be better. So this good is enhanced. The brown species begins to spread until we get to a situation where almost all the beetles are brown. We get a predominant brown colour amongst all the beetles. Therefore, what that does is it causes the diet of the birds then, obviously, to change. So although they eat the green beetles, there are less green beetles to eat because the green beetles have realised, and evolution has realised, that green means you're going to be eaten. So let's change from green to brown. The more brown beetles we have, the less chance of being eaten. Therefore, the greater chance that these brown beetles will reproduce more brown beetles. Okay? So over time, nature has realized very, very quickly that we're better off enhancing the brown and doing away with the green. Now, there's going to be a response to that because the ravens are the birds here that eat the green beetles. If the green beetles don't exist, then there's changes also going to have to take place side by side in the birds in relation to what they eat in order to keep them alive. So you normally have, if there's evolution taking place in one species, there are situations where that change in one species can lead to changes in other species that interact with them. So interaction is a very key thing in the world of natural selection and evolution. For example, modern horses run faster than their ancestors because natural selection favoured faster horses. You might say to yourself, well, what's a faster horse got than a slower horse? The answer is speed. But what's speed good for? Getting away from predators. So if you're faster, you're going to have a greater chance of survival. And that, at the end of the day, is the key thing in terms of natural selection and evolution. If you have a trait that allows you to do something to increase your chances of survival, then that is a good characteristic which has to be refined and enhanced down through time. And because the slow horses fell very, very quickly as food to the predators, the slow horses died away. The fast ones, after generation and generations and generations of reproduction, the fast horses began to predominate. So therefore now today, we've got horses that are much, much faster than they were in their ancestors many hundreds of millions of years ago. So there's an example of one line of evolution of what they call the Mongolian wild horse. And you'll notice, obviously, that this horse here at the very end of this evolutionary process is far more prone to speed than the one over here. Okay, its legs are better for getting at a greater stride and a faster speed than the one from here. So what we've noticed is that down through time, little refinements have been made in this species, causing it to go from a small, slow animal into a fine, big, fast animal that we know today as the modern Mongolian wild horse. For evolution to occur, the characteristics that are favoured by natural selection must be inheritable. So what I mean by that is that the green beetles are going to die away because they're green. The brown beetles are going to survive because they're brown. So therefore, being a brown beetle, reproducing and forming more brown beetles increases the rate of survival. So now, brown is good. So therefore, we begin to notice that as they move through evolution, the characteristic of having a brown colour has to be passed on. It must be able to be passed on to the next generation, so that the next generation will be brown, meaning they can survive longer, and then they'll give rise to a generation that's brown. And at the same time, as the brown generation are proliferating, the green ones are decreasing because they're food. So they're decreasing in number, which means eventually you'll end up with all brown, which won't be eaten, giving that particular brown species of beetle a far better chance of surviving and reproducing offspring. So can we get a situation where evolution, the process of change, of refinement, can that lead to a completely new species? And the answer is yes. And we have an example of that. The penguin is a typical example of where we got a new species of bird. Okay, and I'll explain a bit about the penguin in a few moments. Sometimes a new species can evolve from an existing one. And you might say to yourself, well, how can that happen? And the answer is simple. If you have one species that all of a sudden gets separated into two groups, okay, and those two groups can no longer mix, and both groups find themselves in slightly different areas with slightly different food sources, slightly different environments, then over millions of years, those two species will begin to adapt and change in order to make life possible in the new region. So they'll begin to go on they'll begin to diverge from one another, and they'll begin to have characteristics that will develop in different ways, so that by the time a couple of 100 million years have passed by, you'll end up with two very different species that have different habitats, that have different food types, that have different ways of reproducing, different ways of living, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, they are new species in their own right. They've got a common ancestor, but because of separation, that separation has caused both of them to go on and refine different characteristics that are needed for the different environments in which they find themselves. This happens when a group becomes separated from the rest of the species and evolves in different ways. Now I have a pictorial diagram of that thing here. So here's an island, okay? And on this island we have one species. Over time, the island becomes divided in two. So therefore you now have two pockets of A. But because the habitat here, that means the living conditions, because the habitat here for A and the habitat here for B are very different, what happens is that A slowly evolves into B, helping B to survive better in habitat B. Okay, so you've got one species which all of a sudden experiences a separation. Both groups will continue to reproduce and continue to move down through time, but because we have two new patches of land, which perhaps offer two completely different habitats, the animals will evolve according to where they find themselves. Meaning, A will stay A, but because B is in a completely different habitat, it will evolve different characteristics along the way and eventually end up giving you a new species altogether. If that division happens again, and we now see that we've got three pockets of what was originally species A. A continues to thrive here, B continues to thrive here, but in this new habitat, B slowly evolves into C. So now we've got a situation where one species has given rise to two, and two species have given rise to three. And that will continue and continue and continue. By the way, it doesn't have to be a water separation. Mountains separate C and D, so they can no longer communicate. So you've got A, B, C, and then over here on the other side of the island, on the east side, C slowly evolves into D. So now what was one species is now four species. What drives the change is the habitat in which the animals find themselves. Okay, it's where they're living, because they will respond over time to the conditions that they find themselves in order to produce good traits they can pass on to their offspring to increase their chances of survival. And eventually then, if A breaks again, if there's another separation, well then now we'll have A living here, B living here, species C, species D, and eventually then C will morph into E. So what was one species has now fragmented into 5 species. Original species A, and then the other species that have evolved because of their separation from the original species into B, C, D, and E. The separated group live in a new environment, meaning different characteristics will now be needed for survival in their new surroundings. Penguins, as I said already, are a typical example of this, okay? And here's the theory in relation to penguins. When penguins became separated from the original species of bird that we say they came from, they found themselves far more dependent on water than on air. So they spent more time in the sea. And then over years, they began to realize that birds that were adapted for life in the sea lived longer than birds that weren't adapted for life in the sea. So over hundreds of millions of years, they lost their wings, as in the wings that they had in the original species. They became flippers. The feet lost their talons and they became webbed. The fur, which was the feathers I should say, became very, very small and very densely packed and waterproof. And what you then had was a bird that had evolved from the original species, which the original species was a bird who could fly, into a bird now that can no longer fly, but can adapt itself very well to live in water. Now that's the penguins, okay? And you can see it there. Spending more time in water in their new environment meant that flight was less important. So each successive generation was refining the good things that were needed to survive in the sea. Now you don't need wings to flap to survive in the sea. You need flippers. You don't need talons. You need webbed feet. So these things began to appear in the penguins, making sure that they could survive in an environment that was predominantly surrounded by water and had a rich food source in the water as well. So this whole thing of species evolving within itself and other species then becoming separated and giving rise to new species, we can see very, very quickly that if that theory holds true, then we have a reason why the Earth is covered in a huge number of different species, what we call biodiversity, okay? And that just means the different generations living on the planet. So different species living on the planet. So biodiversity has to do with the number of species that are living around the world at this particular time. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. Life on Earth began almost 4 billion years ago. Natural selection has been operating from the very beginning. So in other words, as the first species appeared, natural selection went to work. What does natural selection do? Refines the good and plays down and gets rid of that which is bad. Okay, that's natural selection. So what's been happening down through time is that species have been changing within themselves subtly. Species have been separated and gone on to form brand new species, and they have populated the entire world with animals and plants that are able to survive very, very well in the environments in which they find themselves. And that's biodiversity. This has resulted in millions of different species now living on the planet. Different species live in particular niche. Now the niche is where you find yourself. Okay, so your niche, if you're talking about what's your niche is not lying. Your family home is your habitat. Your family home is in a certain road. Your road is in a certain environment. It's close to the schools and the churches and the shops and the pubs and everything else. That is your niche. It's where you are. It's where you find yourself situated. So different species live in a particular niche, which includes its habitat, where it actually lives, the food that it eats, which is in its surroundings, and the way in which it interacts with other animals and plants. Does it see other animals as threats to fight with, competition? Does it see other animals as food sources and something to be eaten? Does it see other animals as something that can aid its existence and help it along? So all these questions are playing back all the time in a species, refining it in order to make it possible for that species to live longer and reproduce better. There are 90 different, just as an example, 90 different species of deer in the world. 3 of them live in Ireland. Okay, so if you were to take a look at the 3 species of deer that live in Ireland, what you would notice is that they're subtly different from each other. And the only reason why the 3 species of Irish deer are different from one another is because they have different niches. They live in different places. And living in different places brings on different demands, gives rise to different food sources, gives rise to different competition. Okay, and all of these things playing on a species evolve that species into a, I suppose we want to put it, into a model that is best placed to survive where it is. So, deers that exist in the forest, for example, would be slightly different from deers that exist in open land, because they've adapted to live in shady regions and so on. So 3 of them, as I said, 3 of the 90 different species of deer live in Ireland, and they all have slightly different habitats, giving rise to slightly different modifications in those species. And if you have 3 sets of deer with different species, the only reason why we've got different species is because they live in different niches. So finally, to finish this chapter, one outstanding thing about evolution, and we said already, natural selection, is enhancing the good or refining the good and getting rid of the bad. Now, if it's a case that a species doesn't adapt to live where it is, it will go extinct. If it can't eat, if it can't reproduce, if it can't compete, if it can't enhance, okay, then it's going to die. Simple as that. And if a species of animal can't live where you place it, then all the animals of that species will die, the species will disappear, and we will say that the species has become extinct. Many species, as we already know, which existed in the past are now extinct. Now this brings us back almost to the very first slide. How do we know that there were species living on Earth that we don't have now? And the answer is fossil records. So don't forget about that. Fossils. Yeah, and fossils are evidence that there were species of animals living on this earth that are no longer here. So we've got a fossil record, and that helps us to understand what species have gone extinct over the last several million years. There's one, the dodo, okay, and that's only relatively extinct. The dodo was in quite big numbers up until about the early 1900s, when it went down to very, very small numbers, and eventually it became extinct altogether. All right, now take biotechnology. Is it possible for us to resurrect a species? Is it fair to resurrect a species? If this animal died out because of natural selection, if natural selection said that the dodo can no longer survive, the dodo has to go, yeah, well then, who are we to bring them back and put them back into an environment or niche where they couldn't survive in the first place? If we bring back an extinct species, does it mean it's going to become extinct all over again? And these are ethical questions that we have to work with. Is it fair to bring back an extinct animal, to put it into a niche where it can't eat properly or reproduce properly, or it can't live well? If that's the case, then it's simply going to become extinct again. So maybe there's a case for saying, well, look, if this animal is extinct and nature has decided through natural selection that this animal is no longer to be, leave it so. Leave it and let it be extinct. Let's have pictures of what it looked like. Let's see where it fits in on the evolutionary journey. But to bring it back might cause more problems than solutions. Think of Jurassic Park. If you haven't seen Jurassic Park or you haven't seen the films, go and take a look at it. Look it up. Watch it. Jurassic Park is all about bringing the dinosaurs back to live on Earth today. Okay, look at the problems they face. Look at who they see as food sources. Look at how the poor animals try to fit into a modern world that they're totally ill-equipped for. And you'll see all the problems that that brings on board as well. They became extinct either for 2 reasons. Either because their environment changed and they simply couldn't survive there anymore, or because a different species was better adapted to live in these particular habitats. So go back to what we said about the green beetles and the brown beetles. The green beetles, although they might be in their proper niche, become a food source for the raven. The raven therefore picks them all off, so therefore they disappear. The brown beetle, on the other hand, is not a food source, and it begins to proliferate. So over time, green beetles disappear, brown beetles live. Why? Because natural selection has caused the green beetles to disappear as a food source and the brown beetles to remain behind. That's exactly what we're talking about here. So again, 2 reasons why an animal becomes extinct. Number 1, because the environment changed and therefore they weren't adapted to live there and died out. Or secondly, maybe another species of the same animal, same type of animal, was growing and was evolving better than the previous one and therefore was more suited to adapt, meaning that it will pass on the better genes to future generation, and the older species that were less able to cope will simply die away. Brown bears, which we know, are now extinct in Ireland. Now you might say to yourself, did we ever have brown bears in Ireland? Yes, we did, because they have skeletal remains left behind. We can find the skeletons of brown bears in caves all over Ireland, okay? But we don't have them anymore. It doesn't mean that the brown bear is extinct worldwide. It just means it's extinct in Ireland, again, because we think that the environment changed, okay? The habitat changed during the last ice age, which meant that conditions became unfavourable. The bears couldn't survive, they couldn't reach reproductive age, and therefore they couldn't reproduce fast enough to keep up with the rate at which they were dying. So death took over, reproduction died down, and the animals simply vanished from this country. Still, brown bears thrive in North America because the habitat is correct for them over there. Hence, if the conditions are right and they're adapted to their habitat, they will survive and reproduce and continue to reproduce, and their numbers will remain healthy. Okay, so now that we've come to the end, now I'm also aware of the fact that you've got two little pieces of research that I have to look at. I want you to turn for the rest of this class now to page 154 of your textbook, and I want you to answer key concepts question 1 to 8, and please write the full sentences into your copy. I want you then to go to question 1, 2, 4, 5 of knowledge and understanding, and question 1, 3 and 5 of thinking and investigating. And on Thursday in the live class, I'm going to ask people to read out the research for me, and I'm going to go through these questions with you in preparation for a test on this chapter this day next week. Okay, so today, work on those questions. Thursday, a live class to go through the questions and go through the chapter and take your questions if you have anything you need explained again. And this day next week, next Tuesday, a test on this chapter.